The morning sun cast long shadows across the park as Elijah Montgomery carefully folded his worn blanket, tucking it into the old backpack that held everything he owned. At 98 years old, his hands moved slowly but with purpose, each finger still carrying the memory of 7 decades spent dancing across piano keys. He ran those weathered hands through his thin white hair and glanced at the small pocket mirror he kept, not out of vanity, but to remind himself that he was still here, still breathing, still human. The face that looked back at him told a story of nearly a century of life, deep wrinkles mapping out the joys and sorrows he had known. 3 years. It had been 3 years since he had a proper roof over his head. 3 years since his children sold the family home after his beloved wife Helen passed away. "You'll stay with us, Dad," they had promised. "We'll take care of you." But promises, Elijah had learned, were as fragile as the fallen autumn leaves crunching beneath his feet as he made his way to the public bathroom to wash up. The cold water shocked his system awake as he splashed it on his face. A young man in a business suit rushed in, barely noticing the elderly gentleman at the sink. "Good morning," Elijah offered with a smile. The man glanced up, startled, as if surprised that the old homeless man could speak. "Morning," he mumbled before quickly using the facilities and leaving without another word. Elijah sighed. That was how it had started with his own family, too. First the rushed conversations, then the avoided eye contact, and finally the unanswered phone calls until he realized they had cut him out completely. His son Thomas had taken him in first, but after 2 months claimed his wife was stressed by having an elderly parent in the house. His daughter Patricia kept him for 4 weeks before deciding her small apartment wasn't suitable. The youngest, Robert, never even offered, claiming his children were allergic to Elijah's old cardigan, the one Helen had knitted for him 20 years ago. In the end, they had given him $500 and directions to a shelter. The money lasted a month. The welcome at the overcrowded shelter lasted less. Elijah made his way to his favorite bench, the one with the view of the duck pond where mothers brought their children to feed the birds. He sat down carefully, his joints protesting with familiar pain. From his pocket, he pulled out a half-eaten sandwich someone had given him yesterday. "Breakfast." "Morning, Mr. Elijah," called Carmen, the park maintenance worker who swept the pathways each day. She was one of the few people who actually spoke to him. "Cold night, huh?" "Not too bad," he lied. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, and his thin blanket had barely kept the chill away. "The ducks seem happy this morning." Carmen smiled and continued her work, one of the rare souls who saw him as a person rather than a problem. As he finished his meager breakfast, Elijah closed his eyes and began to hum softly, Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 21, the Andante movement. In his mind, his fingers moved across invisible keys, playing the piece he had performed countless times throughout his life. The music in his head was as clear and beautiful as it had been when he played it for Helen on their 50th wedding anniversary. Music had been his life. After serving in the war, he had returned home and opened a small piano studio, teaching generations of children to love the instrument that had given him so much joy. He and Helen had lived modestly but happily in their little house, raising 3 children who grew up surrounded by melodies and harmonies. "What are you humming there, old-timer?" The harsh voice broke through his musical reverie. A police officer stood before him, hand resting casually on his belt. "Mozart," Elijah replied simply. The officer looked surprised. "You know classical music?" "I taught piano for 65 years, Elijah said with quiet dignity. "Started when I came back from overseas in 45. Something in the officer's expression softened. "My grandmother played. Never could get the hang of it myself." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "Listen, we've had some complaints about people sleeping in the park. I'm going to have to ask you to move along." Elijah nodded and slowly gathered his things. This was familiar too. The constant movement, never being allowed to stay in one place too long. He had become an expert at finding spots where he could rest undisturbed, at least for a little while. Do you need help finding a shelter?" the officer asked, a hint of genuine concern in his voice. "Thank you, but I know where they are," Elijah replied. What he didn't say was that the shelters frightened him. Too noisy, too crowded, too many desperate people fighting for too few resources. At his age, he was vulnerable. The last time he'd stayed in one, someone had stolen his wedding ring while he slept. The only thing of value he had left, now gone. As he walked away from the park, his old legs aching with each step, Elijah thought about how quickly a life could change. One day you're surrounded by family, with a home filled with music and memories. The next, you're carrying everything you own on your back, invisible to most of the world. He made his way downtown, where the tall buildings created wind tunnels that cut through his thin jacket. His pension check, not enough to rent even the smallest apartment, would arrive in 3 days at the post office where he kept a box. Until then, he had $2.37 in his pocket. Passing a music store, Elijah paused. In the window sat a beautiful grand piano, gleaming under the display lights. Without thinking, he placed his fingertips against the glass, imagining the feel of those keys beneath his hands. How long had it been since he had played, since his house was sold, taking with it the upright piano that Helen had saved for years to buy him as a wedding present? "Can't you read?" A sharp voice came from the doorway. The store owner pointed to a sign, "No loitering." "Move along." Elijah pulled his hand away from the glass as if burned. "I'm sorry," he murmured, shuffling away. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered and rain began to fall. Elijah took shelter under the awning of a closed bakery, watching people hurry by with umbrellas and raincoats, rushing to warm homes and waiting families. The rain reminded him of the nights when he and Helen would sit by their living room window, listening to the patter on the roof while he played soft melodies on the piano. Their children would sometimes join them, the whole family wrapped in the comfort of music and each other's presence. Where were they now? His children. Did they ever wonder what had happened to their father? Did they assume he had died alone and forgotten? Or worse, did they simply not care? A young couple walked by, huddled under one umbrella, laughing together. Elijah watched them with a mixture of joy and sadness. He had known that kind of love once. He had known belonging. As evening approached, Elijah made his way to the community center near the edge of town. They didn't allow people to sleep there, but they stayed open until 9, and it was warm inside. Sometimes, if he was lucky and looked presentable enough, he could sit in the lobby for a few hours without being asked to leave. The woman at the front desk gave him a suspicious look as he entered, but said nothing as he took a seat in a corner chair. From there, he could hear faint music coming from one of the rooms down the hall, someone practicing piano not very skillfully. The wrong notes made his fingers twitch involuntarily, the teacher in him wanting to guide those struggling hands. He closed his eyes, letting the imperfect music wash over him, fixing the mistakes in his mind. In his imagination, he was back in his studio, helping a young student master a difficult passage. "Music lives in the space between the notes," he would often say. "Don't just play the keys, feel what they're telling you." When he opened his eyes again, a janitor was standing nearby watching him. "You okay, sir?" The man asked. "Yes, thank you," Elijah replied. "Just resting a bit." The janitor nodded. "Center's closing in 20 minutes. Elijah sighed and began to gather his things. Another night of searching for shelter from the rain. Another night of trying to keep his old bones from freezing. Another night of memories being his only companions. As he stood to leave, the janitor said, "You looked like you were conducting or something, moving your fingers like that while you had your eyes closed." Elijah smiled sadly. "Old habits. I was a piano teacher for most of my life. No kidding. We've got an old piano in the back room. Nobody uses it much anymore." The janitor hesitated, then added, "You can play it for a few minutes if you want, before I lock up." Something sparked in Elijah's tired eyes, a glimmer of the passion that had defined his life. "I would like that very much." As the janitor led him down the hallway, Elijah felt his heart beating faster. His hands, which had been stiff with cold and age just moments before, suddenly felt limber, ready to create the music that had kept him alive all these years. The music that might be the only thing that could keep him alive, now that he had lost everything else. In that moment, following the janitor to an unused piano in a back room of a community center, Elijah Montgomery wasn't a homeless old man whom the world had forgotten. He was a musician again, a maestro about to reconnect with the one true friend who had never abandoned him, music itself. The janitor led Elijah down a narrow hallway, lined with community announcements and children's artwork. Each step seemed to lighten the old man's burden, as if the mere promise of touching a piano again was enough to erase years from his weary frame. "It's not much to look at," the janitor, whose name tag read Lou, once said as he unlocked a door at the end of the corridor. "Been sitting back here gathering dust since they got the electronic keyboard for the main hall. Nobody wanted to pay to keep it tuned." The storage room was cluttered with folding chairs, broken sports equipment, and boxes of holiday decorations. But there, against the far wall beneath a small window, stood an upright piano. Even in the dim light, Elijah could see it was an older model, its dark wood finish dulled by years of neglect, much like himself. "I've got to finish my rounds," Lou said, flipping on the light switch. "Take your time. Just find me when you're done and I'll lock up." Elijah barely heard him leave. He stood transfixed, staring at the instrument as if it were a long-lost friend. Slowly, with reverence, he approached it, his heartbeat quickening with each step. His fingers, those arthritic, weathered digits that had spent decades coaxing beauty from ivory and ebony, trembled with anticipation. He carefully set his backpack on the floor and lowered himself onto the bench. It creaked beneath his slight weight. The fallboard was closed, hiding the keys from view. Elijah placed his palms flat on its surface, feeling the cool wood beneath his skin, and closed his eyes for a moment. Then, with a deep breath, he lifted the fallboard. The keys were yellowed with age, a few chipped at the edges, but they were all there. The familiar pattern of white and black that had been his constant companion throughout his life. Elijah positioned his hands above the keys, hovering just inches away, suddenly afraid. What if he'd forgotten? What if his fingers, stiffened by age and hardship, refused to cooperate? "Just one note," he whispered to himself. "Start with one note." His right index finger descended slowly, pressing middle C. The sound that emerged was slightly flat, but clear enough. Elijah smiled, tears welling in his eyes. He pressed another key, then another, playing a simple C major scale, ascending and descending. His fingers remembered. Encouraged, he began to play Chopin's Nocturne Opus 9, number 2, a piece he had taught countless students, a piece he had played at Helen's funeral. The piano was indeed out of tune, some keys sticking slightly, but Elijah didn't care. He closed his eyes, allowing his muscle memory to take over as his hands moved across the keyboard with surprising dexterity. As the haunting melody filled the small room, Elijah felt himself transported back in time. He was no longer a homeless old man in a storage room, but a concert pianist performing for an audience of ghosts. His beloved Helen, his children when they were young and still looked at him with admiration, his former students who had gone on to share their love of music with others. The piece built to its emotional climax, Elijah's body swaying slightly with the music, his face transformed by the joy and pain of creation. As he played the final notes, letting them hang in the air before fading to silence, he heard a sound he hadn't expected. Applause. Elijah opened his eyes, startled to find Lou the janitor standing in the doorway, along with a middle-aged woman in a cardigan and a teenage boy holding a basketball. "That was beautiful," the woman said, stepping into the room. "I'm Diane, the evening program coordinator. I heard the music and couldn't believe it was coming from in here." Elijah stood awkwardly, suddenly self-conscious of his disheveled appearance. "I'm sorry if I disturbed anyone. The janitor said I could play for a few minutes." "Disturbed?" Diane laughed. "Sir, that's the most beautiful thing I've heard in this building in years. Where did you learn to play like that?" "Juilliard," Elijah replied simply. "A long time ago." The teenager had put down his basketball and was staring at Elijah with newfound respect. "That was sick, old man. Like, actually amazing." Diane shot the boy a look. "Jason, language?" "No, it's all right," Elijah said with a small smile. "Thank you, young man." Lou leaned against the doorframe. "Told you we had an old piano back here." "Didn't tell you we had a concert pianist to go with it." "Former concert pianist," Elijah corrected. "Then a teacher for many years." Diane was looking at him with curious eyes. "I don't mean to pry, but are you currently teaching somewhere?" Elijah glanced down at his worn clothes and tattered backpack. "No, I'm not currently in a position to teach." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room as understanding dawned on their faces. Elijah had been in this situation enough times to recognize what would come next. The awkward excuses, the hasty goodbyes, the relief in their eyes as they escaped the uncomfortable reality of his circumstances. But Diane surprised him. "The center's about to close, but I'd love to hear more of your playing. Would you consider coming back tomorrow? We have a community lunch program. You could play for a bit, have a hot meal." Elijah blinked, uncertain if he had heard correctly. You want me to play here? If you'd like to, Diane said. No pressure. But what you just played, people would love to hear it. I would be honored, Elijah replied, his voice barely above a whisper. As Elijah gathered his belongings, Lou approached him. It's supposed to rain again tonight. Bad storm coming through. Elijah nodded, preparing himself for another night of seeking shelter. Lou scratched his head. Look, there's a maintenance closet down the hall with some old mats. Not much, but it's dry and warm. Security doesn't check it at night. He pressed a key into Elijah's palm. Just be out by 6 a.m. when the morning staff arrives, okay? Elijah stared at the key in disbelief. Why would you do this for me? Lou shrugged. My grandpa was a musician too. Played saxophone in jazz clubs all over Chicago. When he got older, nobody looked out for him. He met Elijah's eyes. Sometimes people deserve better than what they get. That night, for the first time in months, Elijah slept indoors on something softer than a bench. The maintenance closet was small and smelled of cleaning supplies, but to him it was a palace. As rain pounded against the building and thunder rolled across the sky, he lay on the gym mats with his thin blanket pulled up to his chin, the memory of playing piano again warming him from within. He woke before dawn, carefully folded the mats and left the closet exactly as he'd found it. True to his word, he was outside the building before the morning staff arrived, sitting on a bench near the entrance, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Throughout the morning, he found himself humming, his fingers tapping against his leg, playing invisible melodies. The prospect of playing again, of being listened to, of being seen as more than just an old homeless man, had awakened something inside him that he thought had died along with his old life. At noon, he returned to the community center. Diane greeted him warmly, introducing him to the kitchen staff who were preparing lunch for the neighborhood seniors and after-school program participants. We thought you might play a little before lunch is served, Diane explained, leading him toward the main hall where the electronic keyboard stood on a small stage. Nothing formal, just some background music while people arrive. Elijah frowned at the keyboard. Could I use the piano in the storage room instead? I know it's out of tune, but say no more, Diane interrupted with a smile. Lou and Jason already moved it to the hall this morning. They thought you might prefer it. Sure enough, the old upright had been positioned near the windows where natural light spilled across its worn surface. Someone had even attempted to dust it. Elijah ran his hand gently over the top, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Thank you, he said simply. As people began to arrive for lunch, mostly elderly residents and a few young mothers with small children, Elijah sat at the piano and began to play. He started with gentle classical pieces, then moved into some ragtime, and even a few popular songs from decades past. His fingers, stiff at first, loosened as he played, finding their old strength and flexibility. People paused on their way to the lunch tables listening. Some sat in nearby chairs, closing their eyes to better appreciate the music. A few of the older folks swayed or tapped their feet in rhythm. The children, initially running and shouting, grew quieter, watching the old man's hands dance across the keys with fascination. One little girl, no more than 5 years old, approached the piano cautiously. She stood at Elijah's elbow, watching his fingers with wide eyes. Would you like to try? He asked her gently. She nodded, and he lifted her onto the bench beside him. Taking her small hand in his weathered one, he guided her fingers to play a simple melody. Her face lit up with delight when she heard the sound she was creating. Music is magic, Elijah told her, and anyone can make magic with a little practice. As lunchtime ended and people began to leave, many stopped to thank Elijah, to shake his hand, to tell him how much they had enjoyed his playing. For the first time in years, he felt valued, visible. Diane approached him as he was closing the fallboard. That was wonderful, Elijah. Truly wonderful. Would you consider coming back? Maybe regularly. We can't pay much, but we could offer lunch and... She hesitated before adding, Lou mentioned he gave you a key to the maintenance closet. We have a small room upstairs, used to be an office. It has a couch. If you needed a place to stay, it would be better than a closet. Elijah's hands trembled as they rested on the piano. Why would you do this for a stranger? Diane smiled. You're not a stranger anymore. You're our pianist, and everyone deserves a chance to share their gifts with the world. As Elijah followed Diane upstairs to see the room that would become his temporary home, He felt a strange sensation in his chest, a warmth he had almost forgotten. It took him a moment to recognize it for what it was: hope. Word spread quickly about the elderly pianist at the community center. What began as lunchtime performances soon expanded to morning sessions for the seniors' exercise group, afternoon concerts for the after-school program, and special appearances at community events. The small room upstairs became Elijah's home, gradually filling with donated items, a proper bed replacing the couch, a small dresser for the few clothes people had given him, books of sheet music brought by visitors who had heard him play. 3 months after his first performance, Elijah sat at the piano on a Thursday evening, teaching 8-year-old Lily how to position her hands properly. Around them, the main hall buzzed with activity as volunteers set up for the community potluck dinner. "Remember, your wrist should be level with your hand," Elijah instructed gently. "Not too high, not too low. Think of holding a small bird, firm enough that it doesn't fly away, gentle enough that you don't hurt it." Lily adjusted her position, her face scrunched in concentration. "Like this, Mr. Elijah?" "Perfect." He smiled, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. "Now let's try that C major scale again." As Lily began to play, Diane approached with a tall man carrying an expensive-looking camera. "Elijah," she said, waiting for him to finish the lesson. "This is Greg from the Herald. He'd like to do a story about you and the music program you've started here." Elijah blinked in surprise. "Music program? I'm just giving a few lessons to children who are interested." "You're teaching 15 students now," Diane pointed out, "and you've organized them into a beginner's recital for next month. I'd call that a program." Greg stepped forward, extending his hand. "It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Montgomery. I heard you play Bach last week, and it was extraordinary." Elijah shook the man's hand, still uncomfortable with compliments after so many years of being invisible. "Thank you, but I'm rusty. Not what I used to be." "That's part of what makes your story so compelling," Greg said, setting up his camera. "Do you mind if I take some photos while you teach? And perhaps we could talk afterward?" Elijah hesitated, then nodded. "As long as it doesn't disturb Lily's lesson." As he returned to teaching, Elijah was conscious of the camera clicking quietly in the background, capturing moments he once took for granted, his hands demonstrating a technique. Lily's smile when she played a passage correctly, the easy rapport between teacher and student. After the lesson, as Lily joined her mother at one of the dinner tables, Greg sat down next to Elijah. "How does it feel?" he asked. "To be teaching again after everything you've been through?" Elijah considered the question. "Like coming home," he said simply. "Music has always been my home, even when I didn't have one made of walls and a roof." "Would you mind telling me how you ended up homeless? Your students mentioned you went to Juilliard." The familiar pain tightened Elijah's chest, but he found it didn't paralyze him as it once had. "It's a common story, I'm afraid. My wife passed away. My children sold our house, promising to take care of me, but..." He shrugged, not wanting to speak ill of his family. "Life got complicated. I became a burden. Eventually, I found myself on the streets. At 98 years old," Greg said, shaking his head. "It's hard to imagine." "Age doesn't protect you from life's hardships," Elijah replied. "Sometimes it makes you more vulnerable to them." Their conversation continued through dinner, with Elijah sharing stories from his decades of teaching, his time at Juilliard, the concerts he had performed in his youth. He spoke of Helen and their life together, surrounded by music and family. He even talked about his time on the streets, though he glossed over the worst details. "One last question," Greg said as they finished their coffee. "What would you say to others who might be facing similar circumstances? Elderly people who have lost their homes, their support systems." Elijah thought for a moment. "Find what sustains your spirit and hold on to it with everything you have. For me, it was music. Even when I couldn't play, I could hear it in my head. It kept me human when the world tried to make me less than that." The article appeared in Sunday's paper with the headline, "The Homeless Maestro, 98-year-old pianist rebuilds life through music." Accompanying it were photographs of Elijah teaching, playing the piano, and sitting among community members at dinner. His story filled an entire page with quotes from Diane, Lou, and several of his young students. By Monday morning, the community center's phone was ringing constantly. Other newspapers wanted interviews. Local television stations asked to film his lessons. Parents called about piano lessons for their children. And most surprisingly to Elijah, several former professional musicians in the area reached out, offering to help with the program. "I don't understand," Elijah said to Diane as she handed him yet another message. "Why are people so interested in an old man who plays piano?" "Because you remind them that it's never too late," she replied. "That loss doesn't have to be the end of the story." 2 weeks after the article, a local furniture store donated a newly refurbished grand piano to replace the old upright. A music store provided sheet music and theory books. A retired piano tuner offered his services for free. Elijah's small music program expanded to include adult beginners, many of them elderly people who had always wanted to learn but never had the chance. One rainy Tuesday, a young man with a video camera approached Elijah after his evening concert. "Mr. Montgomery? I'm Chris. I run a YouTube channel about local artists. Would you mind if I recorded your performance tomorrow? I think people beyond our community would love to hear you play." Elijah agreed, not fully understanding what YouTube was, but pleased that more people might enjoy the music he loved. The next day, he performed a program of Chopin, Debussy, and Gershwin, his gnarled hands moving with surprising agility across the keys, his face reflecting every emotion in the music. Chris uploaded the video that evening with the title, "98-Year-Old Homeless Pianist Plays Beautifully." Within days, it had hundreds of thousands of views. Comments poured in from around the country, many from people moved to tears by Elijah's playing and his story, which Chris had briefly explained in the video description. More videos followed: Elijah teaching children, Elijah playing duets with other musicians, Elijah telling stories about famous composers between pieces. His quiet wisdom and gentle humor, combined with his undeniable talent, captivated viewers. People began sending donations to the community center, earmarked for the Elijah Montgomery music program. 6 months after he first stumbled upon the abandoned piano in the storage room, Elijah sat in his expanded living quarters, now a small apartment created from 2 former offices, furnished with donations and decorated with framed copies of news articles about him and cards from his students, and tried to make sense of how his life had transformed. And his small desk sat a laptop, a gift from Chris, who had patiently taught the nonagenarian how to use it. Elijah opened it and, with careful one-finger typing, checked the latest video of his performance. The view count had passed 1 million, and the comments section was filled with messages from people sharing how his story had affected them. "My grandfather was abandoned by his family too. Your strength gives me hope. I started playing piano again after 40 years because of you. Please keep teaching us about music and life. Mr. Montgomery." A knock at his door interrupted his reading. It was Jason, the teenager who had witnessed his first performance. Once just a basketball-obsessed youth, he had become one of Elijah's most dedicated students. "Mr. Montgomery, there are some people here to see you. They say they're from the symphony." Elijah raised his eyebrows in surprise but followed Jason downstairs to the main hall. There, waiting by the grand piano, stood an elegantly dressed man and woman. "Mr. Montgomery," the woman said, stepping forward to shake his hand. "I'm Sophia Chen, Director of Community Outreach for the City Symphony. We've been watching your videos and reading about your program here. We'd like to invite you to be a special guest at our community concert series next month." The man beside her smiled. "And if you're willing, we'd like you to perform with the orchestra. Perhaps the Chopin Piano Concerto No. 1? We understand from your interviews that it was a favorite of yours to teach." Elijah steadied himself against the piano, overwhelmed. It had been decades since he had performed with an orchestra. I don't know if I'm capable anymore," he admitted. "My hands aren't what they used to be." "We've seen what your hands can do," Sophia said gently. "They may tell a different story now than they did in your youth, but it's no less beautiful." As they discussed the details of the potential collaboration, Elijah noticed a small crowd gathering at the edges of the hall. Diane and Lou, his students and their parents, regulars from the lunch program, all watching with proud smiles. These people, strangers just months ago, had become his family. Later that evening, after agreeing to the symphony's invitation, Elijah sat alone at the grand piano. The community center was quiet, everyone gone home for the night. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play, not Chopin or Bach or any of the masters, but a simple melody he had composed himself, one that spoke of loss and loneliness, of resilience and redemption, of finding home in unexpected places. As the final notes faded into silence, Elijah whispered to himself. Look at us now. Helen. Who would have thought? He closed the fallboard gently and made his way upstairs to his apartment, his step lighter than it had been in years. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, new joys. For the first time in a very long time, he looked forward to it all. The lights of the concert hall dimmed as Elijah walked onto the stage, his steps slow but purposeful. The audience, nearly 2,000 strong, erupted in applause before he had even reached the piano. He paused to bow, overwhelmed by the reception, then carefully lowered himself onto the bench as the conductor raised his baton. The first notes of Chopin's Piano Concerto No. 1 filled the hall, the orchestra creating a lush backdrop for what was to come. When Elijah's moment arrived, his hands descended onto the keys with confidence born from decades of practice and months of careful preparation. Though his fingers lacked the speed and power of his youth, they possessed something perhaps more valuable: wisdom earned through nearly a century of life, love, loss, and endurance. As he played, Elijah lost himself in the music, aware only of the connection between his hands and the instrument, between the sounds he created and the hearts of those listening. The standing ovation that followed his performance seemed to go on forever, with many in the audience wiping away tears. Backstage after the concert, surrounded by well-wishers, Elijah accepted congratulations with humble gratitude. Sophia from the symphony handed him a bouquet of flowers, while Chris recorded it all for what would surely become another viral video. Diane and a group from the community center had come to support him, their faces glowing with pride. Mr. Montgomery, a television reporter said, approaching with a microphone and cameraman, that was an incredible performance. How does it feel to return to the concert stage at 99 years old? Like visiting an old friend, Elijah replied with a smile. The music never left me, even when everything else did. Your story has touched so many people, the reporter continued. From homelessness to headlining with the symphony in just 8 months. What would you say to those who followed your journey? Elijah thought for a moment. I would say that as long as you're breathing, your story isn't over. And sometimes the most beautiful passages come after what you thought was the end. The reporter thanked him and moved on. Elijah handed his flowers to Diane and sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. For all the joy of the evening, his 99-year-old body was reminding him of its limitations. Mr. Montgomery? A woman's hesitant voice cut through the backstage chatter. Elijah looked up to find a well-dressed woman in her 60s standing before him, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. Something about her eyes, their shape, their color, struck a familiar chord in his memory. Yes, he replied, trying to place her. You probably don't want to speak to me, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I wouldn't blame you. But I saw the news program about you last month, and I've been following the stories online, and I had to come. Elijah's heart seemed to stop as recognition dawned. Catherine? His youngest daughter nodded, tears spilling onto her cheeks. Hello, Dad. The backstage area suddenly felt too crowded, too public for such a moment. Diane, sensing the situation, quickly ushered them to a private dressing room and closed the door, leaving father and daughter alone. They stood in silence, 3 years of absence and decades of complicated history hanging between them. Catherine had aged since he'd last seen her, more gray in her hair, new lines around her eyes. She looked more like Helen now than she ever had before. You played beautifully, she finally said. Mom would have been so proud. The mention of Helen softened something in Elijah. He gestured to a small sofa. Sit, please. My old legs can't stand as long as they used to. They sat together an arm's length apart, neither knowing quite where to begin. I thought you were dead, Catherine said bluntly. When we couldn't find you at any of the shelters, when you stopped picking up your monthly check at the post office. Thomas said you must have died somewhere on the streets. We even checked the morgue reports. Elijah nodded. I left the city for a while. Walked as far as my legs would carry me. Slept in fields, under bridges. I didn't want to be found. Because of what we did to you, she whispered. He didn't contradict her. The pain was still too real to pretend it hadn't happened. Why did you come tonight, Catherine? She reached into her purse and pulled out a small flash drive. I've been watching every video, reading every article. Seeing you teach those children, hearing you play, it reminded me of growing up in our house, how music was always part of everything. Her voice broke. It reminded me of who you really are, who you've always been. She handed him the flash drive. These are photos from the family albums. Your grandchildren's recitals that you missed. Great-grandchildren you've never met. I thought you might like to have them. Elijah took the small device, turning it over in his palm. Images of a life that had continued without him stored in this tiny object. Thank you, he said quietly. Dad, I'm so sorry. The words tumbled out of her. We were wrong. I was wrong. After Mom died, everything happened so fast. Thomas said selling the house made financial sense. Patricia worried about the stairs being dangerous for you. I thought. She shook her head, tears falling freely now. I told myself we were doing what was best for you, but we were really doing what was easiest for us. Elijah sat very still, hearing the confession he had longed for and dreaded in equal measure. Part of him wanted to offer immediate forgiveness, to bridge the gap with his remaining child before it was too late. Another part held back, protective of the heart that had been so deeply wounded. Where are Thomas and Patricia? He asked. Catherine looked down. Thomas won't come. He says it's too late, that too much has happened. Patricia. She hesitated. Patricia feels ashamed. She wanted to come tonight but couldn't face you. Not yet, Elijah nodded, unsurprised. And you? Why are you different? Because I saw what music did for you, she answered. When I watched those videos, I realized that the piano quite literally saved your life when we abandoned you. It gave you shelter, purpose, community, everything we should have provided. She reached for his hand tentatively. And I realized that if music could save you after what we did, maybe there's hope for forgiveness too. Elijah looked down at their joined hands, his weathered and spotted with age, hers showing the first signs of the same. Helen's hands. His hands. The family connection that remained despite everything. I have a new family now, he said gently. People who saw value in an old homeless man when his own children couldn't. They gave me a home, purpose, respect. Catherine winced but nodded. I understand. But, Elijah continued, squeezing her hand, there's always room for reconciliation. Not to go back to how things were, that's impossible. But perhaps to build something new. A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Diane. I'm sorry, Elijah, but there are people waiting to speak with you at the reception. Should I tell them you'll be a while longer? Elijah looked at his daughter. Would you like to join me? Meet some of my students and friends? Catherine's eyes widened. You'd want me there? It's a start, he replied. The reception was held in the Symphony Hall's grand foyer. As Elijah entered with Catherine by his side, he was greeted warmly by musicians, students, and community members. He introduced his daughter simply as Catherine, my youngest, offering no explanation for her sudden appearance or long absence. His new family accepted her presence with grace, including her in conversations and sharing stories of Elijah's impact on their lives. Throughout the evening, Elijah watched Catherine listening to these stories with a mixture of pride and regret on her face. She heard how her father had transformed a community center with his music, how he had inspired children to learn an instrument many had never touched before, how he had given hope to other elderly people who felt discarded by society. Near the end of the reception, one of Elijah's oldest students, a 70-year-old retired teacher named Greta, approached Catherine. Your father changed my life, she said simply. I always wanted to play piano but thought I was too old to learn. He showed me it's never too late to become who you might have been. As they drove to Elijah's apartment at the community center, Catherine was quiet, processing all she had witnessed. When they arrived, she helped her father up the stairs, his energy finally flagging after the emotion and excitement of the evening. His small apartment was neat and cozy, filled with framed photos of his new life. Elijah with his students, Elijah at the community center piano, Elijah receiving an award from the mayor for his contributions to arts education. You've built a beautiful life, Catherine said, looking around, despite everything. Because of everything, he corrected her. Suffering can destroy or transform. I'm fortunate it did the latter for me. He moved to his small kitchenette to make tea, his nightly ritual before bed. Catherine stepped in to help, the domestic task creating a bridge between them. I'd like to come back, she said as they sat with their steaming cups. If that's all right with you. Maybe meet your students, hear you teach, get to know this part of your life. I'd like that, Elijah replied. And perhaps sometime you might consider coming to my house for dinner, meeting your great-grandchildren. They've seen the videos and they can't believe their great-grandfather is Piano Grandpa from YouTube. Elijah chuckled at the nickname. Piano Grandpa. Well, I've been called worse things. As Catherine prepared to leave, she hesitated at the door. Dad, there's one more thing. Your old piano, Mom's gift to you, we didn't sell it. It's been in my living room all this time. No one plays it, but I couldn't let it go. If you'd like it back. Elijah felt a wave of emotion at the thought of Helen's gift, the instrument that had been the heart of their home for so many years. Let's talk about that another time, he said. There's a piano here that needs me now. And students who are counting on me. Catherine nodded, understanding the gentle boundary he was setting. Their reconciliation would be a gradual process, built on mutual respect for the new reality, not an immediate return to the past. After she left, Elijah sat at his window for a long time, watching the city lights and reflecting on the day's events, the triumph of the concert, the unexpected reunion, the first tentative steps toward healing a wound he had thought would pain him until his final breath. He reached for the flash drive Catherine had given him but decided not to look at it tonight. There would be time tomorrow or the next day. For now, he wanted to hold on to the feelings of the present moment, accomplishment, hope, the possibility of forgiveness. As he prepared for bed, he noticed a text message on the phone Chris had taught him to use. It was from Diane. You were magnificent tonight, not just at the piano. Rest well, maestro. Elijah smiled and turned out the light, grateful for the family he had lost and found, and for the one he had found without looking. Snow fell gently outside the community center as people gathered for a special celebration. Colorful banners hung from the walls, and a large cake sat on a table decorated with blue and silver balloons. At the center of it all was Elijah Montgomery, dressed in a new suit, his white hair neatly combed, his eyes bright with amazement as everyone sang "Happy Birthday" to him. 100 years old today. A century of life. The room was filled with his students, community center regulars, musicians from the symphony, and local officials. In the front row sat Catherine, and beside her, to Elijah's ongoing surprise, Patricia, his middle child, who had finally found the courage to reconnect with her father 6 months earlier. Thomas remained absent, the only wound still unhealed. Speech, someone called as the song ended. Others joined in, clapping and encouraging Elijah to share his thoughts. With Diane's help, he stood from his chair and looked out at the faces before him, people who had entered his life when he had lost everything, people who had given him reasons to keep playing, keep teaching, keep living. I'm not sure what to say, Elijah began, his voice soft but clear. 1.5 years ago, I was sleeping on park benches, invisible to the world. Now look at us. He gestured to the crowded room. If there's anything I've learned in my 100 years, it's that life never stops surprising you. Just when you think the music has ended, someone turns the page to a new movement. Applause filled the room, punctuated by a few tearful sniffles. Elijah wasn't finished, though. Last week, a reporter asked me what my secret was for living to 100. I told him it wasn't a secret at all. It was music. It was community. It was all of you. He paused, his eyes moving from face to face. And it was learning that even when you lose everything, you still have something to give. That's what keeps the heart beating, having something to offer the world, no matter how small you think it is. As he sat down to more applause, Diane stepped forward with an announcement. As you all know, what started as Elijah giving a few piano lessons has grown into something much bigger. The Elijah Montgomery Music Program now serves over 100 students of all ages, has 5 part-time teachers, and has become a cornerstone of our community center. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Today, on Elijah's 100th birthday, we're thrilled to announce the next chapter. She gestured to a city official who stood up. The City Council has approved funding for a dedicated building adjacent to our center, the Elijah Montgomery Music Academy, which will offer free and low-cost music education to anyone in our community who wants to learn. Regardless of age or background, gasps and cheers erupted. Elijah sat speechless, tears gathering in his eyes. But that's not all. Diane continued when the noise died down. Thanks to grants from the State Arts Council and donations from people around the country who have been touched by Elijah's story, the Academy will include a special program specifically for homeless and elderly individuals, providing not just music education but also pathways to housing, health care, and employment. The room exploded with applause. Catherine squeezed her father's hand, her own eyes shining with tears. Later, as the celebration continued around him, Elijah sat at the piano, his piano, the one that had first reconnected him with music in that dusty storage room. His fingers, now a century old, moved slowly across the keys, playing not a grand classical piece but a simple melody he had composed himself, one that told the story of his journey from despair to hope. People gradually quieted, gathering around to listen. When he finished, a small girl, Lily, his first student, now 10 years old, approached the piano. "Mr. Elijah, can I show you what I learned for your birthday?" He smiled and moved over on the bench, making room for her. "I would be honored." Lily placed her hands on the keys and began to play the same melody Elijah had just performed, but with her own variations, brighter, more playful, yet recognizably the same piece. Elijah watched her hands, so small and nimble compared to his gnarled ones, carrying his music into the future. When she finished, he hugged her. "That was beautiful, Lily. You added your own voice to the song." "That's what you taught me," she replied. "That music isn't just playing notes, it's telling your story through them." The winter passed into spring, and with it came changes. Construction began on the new music academy, with Elijah visiting the site daily to watch the progress. His health, remarkably stable during his homeless years and his rebirth at the community center, began to show signs of his advanced age. His walks became shorter, his teaching sessions briefer, his naps longer. Yet his mind remained sharp, his passion for music undimmed. When he couldn't physically demonstrate techniques for his students, he found new ways to teach them, through stories, through careful observation, through the wisdom accumulated over decades of playing and teaching. On warm days, Catherine or Patricia would take him to visit construction on the academy building. Sometimes his grandchildren would come along, adults with families of their own who were gradually reconnecting with the grandfather they had nearly lost. Occasionally, even his great-grandchildren would visit, sitting beside him at the piano for simple lessons, creating new family memories to replace those that had been broken. In the summer, as the academy neared completion, the community organized a special concert series featuring Elijah and former students who had gone on to pursue music professionally. Though he no longer had the stamina for full concertos, he played short pieces that showcased the emotion and interpretation that no physical limitation could diminish. After one such performance, he was approached by a thin, elderly man who looked vaguely familiar. "You don't remember me, do you?" the man asked. Elijah studied him. "I'm afraid my memory isn't what it used to be. I'm Richard. We met at the shelter 3 years ago. You used to hum classical music at night. Everyone thought you were just a crazy old man." He smiled. "Turns out you were the sanest of us all." Recognition dawned. "Richard, you shared your blanket with me one night when the temperature dropped. And now look at you, playing concerts, building schools." Richard shuffled his feet. "I came because I heard about your program for homeless folks. I've been trying to get clean, trying to find a way forward. Thought maybe you play an instrument?" Elijah asked. "Used to play guitar. Long time ago." Elijah took his arm. "Come with me. I want you to meet some people." He introduced Richard to the program coordinators, making sure he was connected with both the musical opportunity and the social services that could help him find stability. As he watched Richard carefully holding a guitar for the first time in years, Elijah felt the circle of his own journey completing itself, from homeless to helper, from abandoned to abandoner. As his 101st birthday approached, Elijah's health began to decline more rapidly. There were hospital visits, oxygen tanks, and eventually a wheelchair. Yet he insisted on being at the community center as much as possible, teaching when he could, listening to his students play when he couldn't. The academy building was completed in late autumn. Though the grand opening was scheduled for the following spring, Diane arranged a private tour for Elijah, wheeling him through wide, sunlit hallways with perfect acoustics, past practice rooms equipped with quality instruments, into the performance hall named in his honor. "What do you think?" she asked as they sat in the empty hall. Elijah gazed around the space that had once existed only in his imagination. "I think Helen would be amazed. I think she would say we did good." A week later, surrounded by his 2 daughters, several grandchildren, and Diane, Elijah Montgomery passed peacefully in his sleep, just 2 months shy of his 101st birthday. His hands, which had brought so much beauty into the world, were folded gently across his chest, finally at rest. The funeral was held in the Academy's performance hall, though celebration of life more accurately described the event. Hundreds attended: students, fellow musicians, community members, city officials, and people who had been touched by his story from around the country. Rather than somber music, the service featured performances by his students, from the youngest beginners to accomplished adults, each playing pieces Elijah had taught them. At the reception afterward, people shared stories of how Elijah had affected their lives. The homeless veteran who found purpose through music therapy, the elderly widow who made new friends in his senior piano class, the troubled teenager whose anger found expression through classical pieces rather than violence. As the crowd thinned, Catherine and Patricia approached the grand piano that had been Elijah's favorite. On top of it now rested a framed photograph of their father at his 100th birthday celebration, his hands poised above the keys, his face alight with joy. "He forgave us," Patricia said softly. "Even though we didn't deserve it," Catherine nodded. "And in doing so, he taught us his final lesson." They stood in silence for a moment, each lost in her own thoughts and regrets. Then Catherine spotted Lily, now Elijah's most advanced student, standing nearby. "Lily," she called, "would you play something? One last time for him?" The young girl nodded and sat at the piano. Her hands hovered above the keys for a moment, then descended to play the melody Elijah had composed, his life story in music. But as she continued, the piece evolved, incorporating elements of his teaching, his favorite classical works, and finally, a new section that looked forward rather than back. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Catherine placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "That was beautiful. What do you call it?" Lily looked up, her young face somber yet hopeful. "He always called it the journey home, but I added a new part at the end. I call that part the legacy." 1 month after the funeral, the Elijah Montgomery Music Academy officially opened its doors. The first class of students included people from all walks of life, children from the neighborhood, retirees fulfilling lifelong dreams, and a special group of homeless individuals being given the same chance Elijah had once received. In the main hallway hung a large photograph of Elijah sitting at the piano, his gnarled hands poised above the keys, his face a map of his century of experiences. Beside it was a simple plaque with words taken from his 100th birthday speech. "Even when you lose everything, you still have something to give. That's what keeps the heart beating, having something to offer the world, no matter how small you think it is." Below the plaque sat a guest book, its pages gradually filling with notes from visitors and students. One entry, written in an elderly hand, simply read, "Thank you for showing us it's never too late to come home to the music inside us." As winter turned once more to spring, the sound of practicing instruments filled the building daily. Piano, violin, cello, flute, guitar, each note a continuation of the melody Elijah Montgomery had begun when he first placed his homeless, weathered hands on an abandoned piano and remembered who he truly was.